Have you ever noticed how silence becomes expected of you? Not because it brings peace, but because it protects others from having to deal with who you really are. They say you're easy to talk to, always calm, the one who never starts drama. But deep down, you know what that really means. You're the one who absorbs everything. You're the one who stays quiet while others unload. You're the one who disappears just enough to be convenient. And still, you call that love? You call that being mature? You call that keeping the peace? But let's speak the truth, not the polite one, the brutal one. You were never seen. You were used. Your silence wasn't admired, it was harvested. Your tolerance wasn't respected, it was exploited. And the worst part? You started believing it was your role. The quiet one, the understanding one, the one who doesn't make it harder. But here's what no one told you. Every time you stayed silent when something inside you screamed, you were being trained, not just by them, but by your own fear of conflict, by your deep hunger to be accepted at any cost. You didn't want to lose people. You wanted to feel safe. You wanted to be loved without becoming a problem. So you erased your discomfort. You numbed your anger. You tolerated what you should have resisted. And little by little, you became invisible. Not because others couldn't see you, but because you kept dimming your light to make them comfortable. Let that land. You were used. Not hated, not loved, just used. Like emotional oxygen in a room full of people holding their breath. And now you're tired. Not just physically, but existentially. You look back and realize all those moments when you thought you were being strong, you were actually being quiet, in the hope that silence would be enough to earn affection. But silence doesn't buy love. It only rents you out to people who never plan to stay. So let me ask you, who taught you that being tolerated was a form of being loved? You didn't choose to become this quiet. You were rehearsed into it, like a role cast long before you could say no. The silence you carry, it's not maturity. It's a mask. A carefully stitched script written in the language of survival. Look closely. In your earliest memories, when did your voice first feel like a threat? Was it when you said no and saw the face of disappointment twist in front of you? Was it when your anger was called disrespect? Or your tears were met with silence? Was it when you were told you were too sensitive, too emotional, too much? That's where the programming began. Not in logic, but in emotion. In that small, sharp wound where you learned that being loved meant being less. You didn't learn boundaries. You learned diplomacy, the kind that poisons. You learned to read rooms like war zones. You learned to speak gently, not because it was kind, but because it was safer. Love became conditional. Acceptance came at the cost of volume. And over time, you mastered the subtle art of disappearing while staying in the room. Let that land. You were used. Not hated, not loved, just used. Like emotional oxygen in a room full of people holding their breath. And now you're tired. Not just physically, but existentially. You look back and realize all those moments when you thought you were being strong, you were actually being quiet, in the hope that silence would be enough to earn affection. But silence doesn't buy love. It only rents you out to people who never plan to stay. So let me ask you, who taught you that being tolerated was a form of being loved? Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. You didn't choose to become this quiet. You were rehearsed into it, like a role cast long before you could say no. The silence you carry, it's not maturity. It's a mask. Here's the cruel brilliance of it. You became so good at suppressing yourself that even you forgot you were acting. But your body didn't. Your jaw clenched, your stomach turned, your sleep fractured. That's not anxiety. It's the ghost of unspoken truths knocking inside your chest. And this isn't just psychology, it's theater. Because the good child, the understanding one, the mature one, they were roles. Roles created not for your authenticity, but for your utility. The adults around you didn't always intend to wound, but wounded people teach protection, not connection. So when they modeled silence, detachment, cold control, you learned to bury your voice beneath politeness. You learned to become agreeable in order to become lovable. And now, decades later, you're wondering why your relationships feel unbalanced, why you never quite feel safe, even when no one is yelling, why your understanding is always expected but never returned. Here's the truth. You didn't choose submission, you inherited it, passed down like an heirloom of invisible chains. But now the question is no longer, why did it happen? The question is, who are you without that role? And the silence you've used to survive, could it finally become the silence that sets you free? There's a kind of violence that leaves no marks. No shouting, no hitting, just rewiring, word by word, silence by silence. That violence is psychological, and it begins when someone convinces you that your perception is flawed. They say, "You're overreacting. That's not what I meant. You always take things the wrong way." And slowly, you begin to believe them. You begin to doubt your own signal. You question what you felt. You apologize for things you didn't do. You rewrite memories in favor of the person who's harming you, because they've made you think that you're the unreliable one. This is not love. This is control. And its most effective form is quiet, almost elegant. Because the more subtle it is, the less you notice you're bleeding. Here's the hidden game. They don't need to overpower you. They just need to narrate your experience before you can speak it. If they name your anger irrational, your silence becomes guilt. If they call your truth dramatic, your memory becomes fiction. And if they frame your reaction as too much, they win without ever having to justify their own behavior. This is the war of language versus reality. And the moment you start adjusting your truth to avoid conflict, they've already won. Because it's not about the facts, it's about the frame. Whoever gets to define the meaning wins. This is why you keep walking away from conversations feeling smaller. This is why you're exhausted without knowing why. Because you're being drained by the mental gymnastics of staying agreeable, of constantly shrinking your truth just to avoid being labeled difficult. And what's worse? You internalize their script. You become your own warden. You begin to silence yourself before anyone else does. You think, maybe I'm too sensitive, when what you actually are is awakening. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You're not being too much. They're just not used to someone waking up mid-performance. They're not angry because you said something wrong. They're panicked because you stopped letting them define your reality. And that is where power begins, not in speaking louder, but in seeing clearer. Because when you reclaim your right to name your experience, you take back the keys to your own psyche. Let me say it plainly. You're not broken. You were edited. Now, who do you become when you take back the pen? There comes a moment when the old strategies stop working. Explaining no longer earns understanding. Justifying yourself doesn't prevent the next wound. Softness becomes a language no one listens to. And so you go silent. But this time it's different. This silence isn't collapse, it's containment. Not a lack of words, but a refusal to waste them. It's the moment when you realize that the more you explain yourself, the more you feed the illusion that your truth needs permission to exist. So you stop. Not out of fear, but out of power. You begin to understand what Machiavelli hinted at, that fear and control don't always come from action, but from restraint. Let that settle. Your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. The moment you withdraw, the energy shifts. Suddenly, they notice, they wonder, they panic. Why? Because people who rely on your emotional labor, your patience, your reassurance, your compliance, can't function when you go quiet. You weren't just being kind. You were being a buffer, a mirror, a balm. And now that you've stopped performing, they're forced to sit with their own reflection, and they don't like what they see. This is the silent counterattack. You remove yourself from the theater. You let their lines echo into nothing. You say nothing, and they feel it like a scream. Because in truth, they weren't afraid of your words. They were afraid of your withdrawal, of the moment they no longer had access to your reactions, because reaction is control, and silence is the end of that game. And here's the most unsettling part for them. You don't look angry. You look calm. Calm like someone who's done. Calm like someone who's seen behind the curtain and simply left the show. That calm is terrifying, because it doesn't beg, it doesn't negotiate, it just exits, clean, cold, sovereign. This is not emotional detachment. This is emotional clarity. You're not punishing them, you're preserving yourself. You're not trying to win the argument anymore. You're removing yourself from the arena. No more debates. No more proofs, just silence, not as surrender, but as command. And when they ask, why aren't you saying anything? You smile, because you finally understand. The most dangerous thing you ever did was nothing at all. There's a sacred moment in every awakening when the silence shifts from being a shield to becoming a sword. Not a violent sword, not reactive, not loud, but precise, surgical. It happens when you stop asking yourself, what do I need to say to be understood? And instead begin asking, what happens if I stop explaining altogether? Because that's the day you realize every explanation was a thread tying you back to the expectations of others, to their image of you, to the version they preferred, quieter, softer, smaller. And now you start cutting, one by one. The thread that told you to apologize for having needs, the thread that made you feel guilty for pulling away, the thread that whispered, "You're too cold," every time you set a boundary. Cut, cut, cut. There is no ceremony for this, no applause. Just the terrifying, liberating stillness of no longer being emotionally available for rent. This is the quiet rebellion, the revolt that doesn't scream, the defiance that doesn't declare itself. Because true rebellion is not about noise, it's about detachment. And this inner detachment is not indifference, it's sacred clarity. It's you saying, I will no longer bleed for people who never learned how to hold their own wounds. Here, the archetype of the rebel silent one awakens fully. Not the revolutionary with fire in his fists, but the one who simply walks away and never looks back. Because some wars are not worth fighting, not because you'd lose, but because they were designed to keep you from ever being free. And that's the ritual, to look at the strings tied to your wrists and say, this is not love, this is control, and I refuse to dance for it anymore. You don't announce this, you don't explain it, you just begin to behave differently. You answer less, you return later, you stop overcompensating. You become still. And in that stillness, they notice. They sense it. The shift, the fracture, the retreat. And it terrifies them. Because they know, people like you, the ones who always gave, always bent, always stayed, when they stop for good. So let the silence speak now. Not in bitterness, but in sovereignty. You're not being cruel. You're being clear. The rebellion has already happened. They just didn't hear it, because it happened without a sound. First, they question you. Then, they mock you. Then, they fear you. Why? Because your silence has exposed the imbalance they worked so hard to hide. They used to rely on your immediate replies, your emotional labor, your need to explain yourself to feel understood. But now, you don't answer right away. You don't soften your tone. You don't engage on command. You are no longer predictable. And for people addicted to control, unpredictability is a threat. Not because you've become dangerous, but because you've become sovereign. And so, the narrative shifts. You've changed. You've become cold. You're acting weird. But they don't say, you stopped letting me drain you. They don't say, you're no longer available to be managed. So, they call you distant, detached, difficult. Because what they're really saying is, I don't know how to manipulate you anymore. That's what happens when the dynamic collapses. The one who was always reasonable becomes unavailable. The one who was always kind becomes ungrateful. The one who always bent now stands still. And that stillness makes them anxious, because stillness leaves them alone with themselves. And most people will do anything, beg, guilt, rage, to avoid hearing the sound of their own emptiness. But you're not here to carry that for them anymore. You've stopped interpreting their silence as your fault. You've stopped translating their needs as your purpose. You've stopped performing. And that decision has consequences. Because when you withdraw from a toxic loop, the system built around your compliance begins to collapse. They depended on your predictability. They depended on your empathy. They depended on your guilt. Without those tools, they're left with their own reflection, and it terrifies them. So they try to recapture you, with apologies that smell like manipulation, with concern that feels like surveillance, with love that sounds more like negotiation. But you've seen too much. You've heard the subtext behind the words, and now you no longer answer to it. Let them call you strange. Let them say you've changed, because you have. You are no longer a participant in their theater. You are the silence they can't decode, the mirror they can't avoid, the exit they never expected. So when they say, "You're not the same," you can simply say, "Exactly." You spent so much of your life believing that resolution came from being understood, from making your point clear, from being heard. You thought if you just said it the right way, with enough calm, with enough logic, with enough patience, they would see you. But the truth is brutal. Some people don't want to see you. They want to manage you. They want access to your emotional code so they can rewrite it for their benefit. And when you stop reacting, you take that access away. This is not about being passive. It's about being impenetrable. You begin to understand something deep, almost ancient. Not every trigger deserves a response. Not every provocation is worth decoding. Not every battle is yours to fight. Because some battles were never about truth. They were about extraction of your time, your energy, your clarity. You've done the work. You've spoken the truth. You've sat in the fire of your own silence and let it shape you. And now you don't need to win the argument. You just don't need to be in the ring anymore. There is a strange kind of peace that comes with this. Not the peace of everything being resolved, but the peace of no longer needing to resolve everything. They may still circle around you, poke at your boundaries, perform their old scripts, but you're no longer available for that play. You're not angry, you're not defensive, you're clear. And that clarity is your protection. No more clarifying what you meant. No more explaining why you pulled away. No more trying to make it all make sense. Let them misunderstand you. Let them question your silence. Let them fill in the blanks with whatever makes them feel better. Because you've stepped into a kind of control that doesn't require domination, just absence. Not coldness, not cruelty. Just a withdrawal of energy from systems that never fed you. And maybe, just maybe, you're not silent because you're afraid. Maybe you're silent because you finally realized you don't owe anyone your voice. Not anymore. So the final question isn't, how do I make them hear me? It's this: if I stop reacting, what's left of them in me?